So thank you again so much for coming. My name is Sarah Boleen. I'm the events coordinator here, and really on behalf of the entire staff, we're so glad to welcome you. And I'm so pleased to welcome Sean Strub tonight for his book, Body Counts, a memoir of politics, sex, AIDS, and survival. In the book, Sean charts his remarkable life from upstart Georgetown freshman with a plum job at the Capitol to New York in the early days of the AIDS crisis through his own diagnosis, as well as becoming the first openly HIV positive candidate for U.S. Congress. And as he writes in the book, he makes the conscious choice to, quote, be both an entrepreneur and an activist. We were talking about what amazing blurbs and reviews the book has been getting, and I liked what our friend Richard McCann had to say about the book. He says, body counts, so smart and affecting, idealistic and clear-eyed, chronicle Strub's own personal experience with HIV, and at the same time explores how culture shapes us and how we can shape it in turn. Strub's memoir, like Strub himself, is an inspiration. Sean is the executive director of the Zero Project, which combats the criminalization of people with HIV, and he founded Pause magazine, which we actually have some copies up front, so please take a look and grab one. And he's a frequent public speaker. We're so glad that he's with us here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Sean Strub to Politics and Prose. It's all you, Sean.
Well, thank you.
Do you mind coming to the mic?
Oh, no, not
Thanks.
at all. All right.
He's a little taller than me.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Coming back to Washington always has particular meaning for me because it was such an important part of my young adulthood. And seeing so many friends showing up tonight really means a lot to me. Some of them who, when I'm done, could probably stand up and give the rebuttal. But it really is wonderful to see friends. And I know there's sort of tough competition tonight, but I hope the president finds an adequate audience for what he has to say. The book, actually the whole part about Washington and coming out and before the epidemic wasn't originally going to be part of it. And every time I met with my editor, Nan Graham and Paul Whitlatch at Scribner's, they kept asking more questions about that. So actually that's now a substantial part of what we ended up with. Starting with when I arrived in Washington in the spring of 1976, I was 17 years old. It was a very interesting and kind of an exciting time to be in Washington. It was right after the Vietnam War, right after Watergate. Jimmy Carter was running for president, telling people, I promise I will never lie to you. There was a sort of a sense of new national renewal at the time that the country had turned the corner from a very sort of dark era. And there were all sorts of new government reforms coming in. There was the freshman class in Congress, the Watergate babies who were very reform-minded. And it just felt like it was the dawn of a whole new era. When in fact, in retrospect, it was sort of the last days of closing a window on liberalism for a generation. And I was a precocious youngster, yet remarkably naive about my body and my sexuality. And so I dealt with those things in Washington. I came here, my parents think I came here to go to school at Georgetown. I really came for a patronage job running an elevator in the U.S. Senate, where I was quickly running a senators only elevator. And that was an incredible and sort of intimate introduction to politics, to the workings of government, and specifically the workings of the Capitol. In the book, I talk about things like wandering around the Capitol in the middle of the night and late at night, and going up into the dome, and actually sneaking a joint up there one night, looking out over the whole city from the dome. Other occasions when the Senate would be in session late, and the elevator operators had to stay late, and we would get annoyed with them. We wanted them to go home. And on several occasions, we would sneak into the Senate engineer's office and crank up the heat in the Senate chamber. A lot of things that are probably just not even conceivable today with the security differences and everything else. But the section I want to read is actually the prologue, and is not a Washington section, but is about the ACT UP Stop the Church demonstration in New York. that in some ways is sort of reflective of the whole arc of the book, with the personal stuff, the activism, and other things. So, in December 1989, New York City. I'm nervously sitting in a pew near the front of St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, where John Cardinal O'Connor is about to celebrate Mass. It has been years since I attended a Catholic Mass, and even longer since I took communion, the holiest of sacraments, but that is why I'm here. Looking up at the cathedral's soaring nave, I remember the awe I felt as an altar boy at St. Mary's in Iowa City, and later the anger when the church betrayed me. It is bitterly cold, a near record low. Many parishioners wear heavy coats as they hold hymnals in gloved hands. Slush-covered boots have left a wet trail down the long center aisle. There's a puddle under my pew. The mood in the church is tense, nothing like the droning boredom of the masses of my youth. As the minutes pass, I think of the Jesuits who taught me as a child that a good Catholic acts upon the church's social teachings, even if that means confronting the church. My hands are trembling with the cold, my apprehension and other feelings too deep to name. Outside St. Patrick's, 4,500 angry men and women have assembled, packing Fifth Avenue and chanting and waving placards that read, "Curb your dogma," "Papal bull," and "Condoms, not coffins." Fists pump the air, bullhorns blare. ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, is protesting O'Connor's assault on safe sex and reproductive rights. There's an almost carnival-like spirit to the demonstration, with ACT UP affinity groups, such as Church Ladies for Choice, the Hail Marys, and Speaking in Tongues, performing their protests. In ACT UP, high camp and high seriousness are uniquely compatible. An artist named Ray Navarro is dressed as Jesus Christ, swathed in a white shroud, carrying a large wooden cross over his near skeletal shoulder. His bearded face is gaunt, and he wears a crown of thorns over his long, thinning hair. Despite the cold, Ray looks beatific. He'll be dead in less than a year. Keith Haring is there too, in a knitted cap with a long, hand-knitted scarf wrapped around his slender neck. He has 2 months left. Inside the cathedral, O'Connor's Mass is interrupted again and again by ACT UP protesters. Surreptitiously spread throughout the church, they stand up and yell out their statements. My friend Michael Petrellis climbs on a pew and shouts, "O'Connor, you're killing us!" Another friend, Jamie Leo, dressed as a priest near the front of the church, offers up a prayer in protest. 2 boyfriends in black leather motorcycle jackets handcuff themselves to one pew. Right after O'Connor begins his homily, 30 protesters stage a die-in, blowing whistles, throwing hundreds of condoms in the air and going limp in the center aisle. The cops, 2 long lines of blue on either side of the cathedral, have their moment, binding wrists with plastic handcuffs and carrying the protesters away on stretchers as if they were taking them to a hospital rather than to paddy wagons. With his homily in tatters, O'Connor retreats from the altar to his throne-like chair. He sits with his head in his hands, melodramatically trying to convey spiritual pain. Photographs of the media-savvy cardinal looking tragically besieged will elicit overwhelming sympathy when they appear on the front pages of Monday's newspapers. Communion begins amid the general confusion. ACT UP protesters line up, interspersed among the regular parishioners, but when it is their turn, they make loud political pronouncements. Safe sex is moral sex. I support a woman's right to choose. Condoms save lives. Soon, it is my turn to receive the body and blood of Christ. A small, dark-skinned priest is serving my cue. His white, green, and gold vestments are oversized and bright. He hesitates briefly, his eyes fixed on the pink triangle and Silence Equals Death logo visible on the t-shirt underneath my coat. Then he holds the host in the air and intones with a strong Spanish accent, "The body of Christ." This is the moment, my moment to confront the church, when instead of repeating "the body of Christ" as expected, I am to make my political statement. But I haven't prepared one. When I rehearsed this moment in my mind, I imagined I might break into tears or erupt in rage, because no slogan, in fact no words at all, seemed adequate. May the Lord bless the man I love, who died a year ago this week, I hear myself say. My voice begins as a tremble but finishes strong. Police, standing a few feet away, are ready to intervene, watching to see how the priest reacts. His hand jerks slightly, but he looks me in the eye and gives me the wafer. With my heart pounding, I walk back to my pew. My mind is fixed on bodies, but not the body of Christ. I think of Michael's body and the agonizing brain infection that turned his last days into a kind of crucifixion. I think of the bodies of the protesters carried out on stretchers and the bodies of those chanting outside, many struggling to survive. I think of my own body, wondering how much longer it will last. Parishioners are staring at me, their faces disgusted or sympathetic, or just plain stunned. Some have their heads bowed, hands pressed tightly in prayer like the devout at St. Mary's, their faith unshakable and unwilling to brook any criticism of the church. They might be praying for us. After Mass, I pass through the cathedral's heavy doors into the bright sunlight, and it seems to me into the arms of my true community. I am exultant, in a state that feels like grace, certain that if I am to die of AIDS, I will die as a fighter, not a victim. So 3 things I always like to point out about that demonstration and that passage, which I'll relate quickly, and then we can have some discussion. The first is that demonstration was incredibly controversial. At one point, it threatened to really divide ACT UP in a way some of us feared might be permanent. We argued about it all summer long on in the room at the Gay and Lesbian Community Services Center on 13th Street in New York, an unair-conditioned room in what seemed like an especially hot summer, packed with 300 or 400 people every Monday night. And ultimately, we decided to proceed with it in conjunction with WHAM, the Women's Health Action Mobilization. And the day after the demonstration, so this was on Sunday, Monday morning by 10 o'clock in the morning, everyone from Gay Men's Health Crisis to the American Foundation for AIDS Research to gay organizations all had their press releases out condemning us. We were even more isolated after that. There was no one who supported this action. About 110 people were arrested that day. If you look at the list of the names of the people arrested, roughly half of them were arrested inside the church and about half of them were arrested outside the church. And the names of the ones arrested inside the church are overwhelmingly, clearly culturally Catholic. They're Polish names, they're Irish names, they're Italian names. And in that, I think, is something very important, that those of us who are raised in a Catholic tradition, I one time estimated I had attended more than 1,000 masses in my life. Even if we had left the church, we still had some sense of ownership, some sense that we had a right to take our redress directly to the church. And in this case, the church is the seat of the Catholic Church in America. The second point I like to make is that coincided with a period where the church was enjoying its sort of peak level of influence in American politics. That ever since then, for all sorts of reasons, not just because ACT UP showed up there, but I like to think that was a little part of it, the church's influence has declined. And in the way that the Stonewall riots in 1969 were the very first time that the gay community in New York pushed back against the civil code that oppressed us, really said, we aren't going to take this anymore, when the cops were there arresting people and beating people. 20 years later, at St. Patrick's Cathedral was the first time that we really pushed back against the religious code that oppressed us, where we said, no, this is a limit. We are not going to allow this any longer. And I think that in the almost 25 years now, it'll be 25 years this December, past, that the perception of the importance of that action and its meaning has only increased over time. The third thing I like to point out is that was the action that actually brought Keith Haring to start coming to ACT UP meetings. And I'll tell you why. Keith Haring, as most of you probably know, was a pop artist who in the late 80s became immensely famous and popular all over the world. And he was my age. We were born just a few days apart. We arrived in New York within a few weeks of each other. And a number of us had been trying to get Keith to come to ACT UP meetings. His HIV diagnosis was a big secret. He was concerned about how it would affect the market for his paintings. He had seen what happened after Andy Warhol died and Jean-Michel Basquiat had died, and there was this sort of intense speculation that he found incredibly distasteful. And so he was keeping that a secret. There was a man I chaired the fundraising committee, and one of the members of the fundraising committee, who was a very dear friend, was a retired Broadway gypsy, a Broadway dancer named Swen Swenson. He was a little bit older than everybody else in ACT UP. He was kind of like the kindly uncle. He was probably my age. And Swen was very close friends with Keith. And at the ACT UP meetings on Monday night, Swen would go, there were tables at the back of the room, and Swen would pick up copies of the brochures or the testimonials or the flyers or the news clippings, whatever was being shared, and make a little packet, posters, buttons, and take it to Keith after the Monday night meeting, because Keith painted at night, and Swen would go and sit with him on Monday nights through the night as Keith painted. And that became a very important source of information for Keith, whose diagnosis was a secret, so his sources of information were relatively restricted. So he had an appreciation for ACT UP. Well, in the lead up to the demonstration, two members of ACT UP, Victor Mendolia and Richard Deagle, created a poster that was, I think, quite brilliant. And the poster was in red and black and white, and it had two images on it. And on one side, there was an image of Cardinal O'Connor wearing his mitre, which is sort of the pointed hat. And on the other side of the poster, in roughly the same shape, it was a photograph of a flattened out used condom. O'Connor, condom. Across the top of the poster in great big red letters, it said, "Know your scumbags." And underneath the condom, in smaller type, it said, "This one prevents AIDS." And when Swen took that poster to Keith that night, he just cracked up. He said, "Okay, that's it. I got to come see what's going on here." So he started coming to the meetings not long before the St. Patrick's Action, and we did a direct mail fundraising piece with him, and he was quite active for a few months. But I always joke that it was that poster that, it's not a joke, it actually was that poster that got him to finally start coming to the meetings. So happy to take questions.
Love to hear from you. If you do have a question, please go to one of our two microphones. Don't be shy.
There are several people in the room who are mentioned in this book. One of them is arriving over here right now. Somehow he did not make it into the index, but he is in the book.
I've actually read it.
Given the medications and social changes since the 70s and 80s, would you say that HIV has, it's a chronic disease now? It's considered a chronic disease, or what's your opinion about that?
Sure. Well, for people who have access to treatment and who are acquiring HIV today, it's essentially a chronic manageable illness. They can expect to live a normal lifespan. But those are, having access to adequate treatment is a big if, and a privilege the vast majority of people with HIV in the world don't have, and actually including a number of people in the U.S. But.
Why did you feel compelled to write this memoir?
Compelled is a pretty good word. I actually resisted writing about the epidemic, and when I decided I did want to write a book, I looked at several of the topics and did some research, and then I was having a conversation actually with Michael Weinrip from the New York Times, and trying to convey to him what it was like in those years. And I kept talking about all these people, and I realized they were all gone. And at one point I said, well, somebody's got to be the memory. And it sort of dawned on me that as time passes, there are fewer and fewer people who can speak firsthand, who were on those front lines from the very beginning. And if we don't tell this history, we are subject to others' interpretation of it. And in some ways, that's a little analogous, I think. And I'm always, Holocaust analogies are problematic, but the bulk of the cultural production, the exhibits, the show, the films, the books, but the Holocaust didn't happen in the 1940s. It didn't happen in the 1950s. It didn't start to kick in until the early 1960s, and then it increased in volume every year, really up well into the 80s, because it took a certain amount of time for people to adjust and absorb, and in many cases then process grief that maybe they had compartmentalized or stored away. And I think that's something that a lot of long-term survivors, whether they have HIV or don't, but who were so engaged in the epidemic, are now dealing with some number of years later. And it is, I speak on campuses quite a bit, and it is astonishing. This is recent history. This is, within our lifetime as adults for most of us, and it is so unknown. So the never again, message that we hear so insistently from Holocaust survivors has a real resonance, I think, for people who lived through the epidemic.
Hi. I haven't had the opportunity yet to read the book, but I'm studying memoir, and I was just curious about your process for that, for accessing memories and reaching back to things you experienced or maybe peripherally experienced through friends, and just how you went about kind of accessing events and memories.
Well, first I'll say that memory is the least reliable source, I found out. But what I did, I never really kept a journal, but I had diaries, would scribble in an appointment or whatever, and sometimes indecipherable. I'm still trying to figure out who Helen Thomason is, which I apparently had lunch with any number of times in the mid-'80s, and I have no recollection who this is. And I did a number of different things. I created a calendar of things from my own calendar. I put it on a long sheet of paper I taped together. And then I looked at the big news events in each year that you can look up on Google and sort of headlines, and that prompted all sorts of other things, either additional memories or where I was or something like that. And then I went back and talked to people, tracked down people I hadn't been in touch with in many, many years. One of them is right over here. And so talk to them and get their kind of memories of that time, and that process was sometimes a little painful, but I really enjoyed it. And once I went into that process, the book kind of came out of it, if that makes sense. Sure, yeah. Nan Graham at Scribner kept telling me, let chronology be your friend. She says, when you get stuck, just ask yourself, what happened next? Whatever it is.
Sean, it's really great to see you. I, as one of your longtime fans, I can't think of a more fair-minded, trustable source to write this document. So I want to say that first off.
Thank you.
I myself have experienced of late that I was checked out emotionally through most of what was going on with AIDS. And so as you lived it at the time, and then you relived it while writing the book, I'm curious what new insights about yourself or insights about what was going on at the time emerged that at the time, because you were in it, you just couldn't experience or know.
Right. Well, at the time, we were young. We were in our 20s. We didn't know any different, People say, how did you deal with the dying and the deaths and so on? People dealt with the epidemic in all sorts of different ways, right? And, some people isolated themselves from it. They had to do that. I'm not saying this with a judgment about it, but that's what they had to do. Others were almost drawn to it, which I think is more like me. I was really, drawn to it. And so that made my personal familiarity with death that much greater, because that's where I was. But one of the things that, as I was looking back and going this, is just how incredibly young I was and other people were to have this thrust upon us, and how alone we were. You know, I mean, it's the closest thing I've ever read to describing what a lot of that time felt like is a passage from the guy who wrote the Vietnam book, Michael. No. There. And dispatches. That's it. Thank you very much. I know I have to write it down to remind myself. Because there really was a period of time when, I think it says in the promotional materials, going to more birthday parties or more memorial services and funerals than birthday parties, and there were a number of times when I went to 2 such memorial things in one day. I remember one time there was a third one I wanted to go to. That was somebody I knew. I didn't. But and you couldn't look back because it was all happening so fast. You didn't have time to grieve. You didn't. I can't tell you how many memorial services and funerals I've been at that I never shed a tear. It just somehow wasn't in me then, and and sort of years and years later. So going back and looking at it, just thinking how incredibly young we were, how alone we were, and how horrible that is for any young person to have that thrust upon them. That's probably the overarching thing that I look back on. I mean, I see some of the activism in differently today than I did at the time. A lot of what I kind of reject the what I call the AIDS ennoblement theory, that we were all heroes and we were all resilient. We changed the world and this and that, and I mean, I guess a little bit of that's true, but having HIV doesn't make somebody a hero, and not everybody behaved wonderfully, either people with HIV or not. Some of the most painful and stigmatizing kind of experience I've had were from other gay people, wasn't from non-gay people. And writing honestly about that, we have been so in touch with the failures of the federal government, the Reagan administration in New York, the Koch administration, the pharmaceutical industry, the medical establishment, all rightfully so. But we've been much less willing to look at our own community's leadership and where we might have made mistakes. And I try and do that here without condemning people individually or whatever. Everybody was frightened, and almost everybody was operating from what they really thought was the best thing at the time. But we did make mistakes, and it is important to understand the extent to which young people don't understand the extent to which gay people really were despised. I mean, there's not a better word than that. It's not stigmatized, it's really despised. And when the epidemic hit in 1981, just look at the immediate, 3 or 4 years. First of all, it was, a dozen years after Stonewall. So it was really, it was like today the epidemic and, Stonewall, happened in 2002. We had just achieved our very, very first political victories. When Ed Koch and Bella Abzug introduced the first gay rights bill in Congress as a symbolic measure in 1974. The passage of municipal non-discrimination ordinances in Miami and St. Paul and Eugene and a couple of other cities. The movement was just becoming national. It had been totally local, but just in the late 70s, it started to coalesce a little bit as a national movement. But then those victories were under attack. There was a persistent effort within the APA to change it back to being a mental disorder, going back and fiddling with that. That was a constant battle. That wasn't a victory won and then you walked away. The municipal non-discrimination ordinances, most people are familiar with the Dade County campaign with Anita Bryant. And not only was that rescinded, but then the next year the St. Paul one was. But it was also another change in that homosexuals were, up until that time, were largely homosexuality was sort of on that list of biblical sins, right? Fornicators and adulterers and, sodomites and whatever. It wasn't so much thought of in terms of individuals. And this was a time when it was becoming much more personalized, and particularly around activists, right? Militant activists, homosexual activists. So you had the repeal of the non-discrimination ordinances and these public campaigns that were unbelievably, Anita Bryant calling us child molesters and they're after your children in a much more personal and intense way than had ever been present in the public discourse to any degree. Harvey Milk was shot in 1978, which was incredibly traumatizing. The next year, his killer was let off with the lightest possible sentence that sparked spontaneous demonstrations all over the country. The next year, Ronald Reagan gets elected, and we learned about Jerry Falwell, who, until then, these televangelists were sort of an idiosyncratic, thing that was on TV at 4 a.m. on Saturdays or something. And suddenly they had arrived as this major new political force kind of out of nowhere. And then 2 weeks after Reagan was elected, there were the Ramrod shootings in New York, where a mentally ill man with an automatic weapon came into a popular bar and shot it up and killed people. So, and then 6 months later, the epidemic. So the whole idea of the gay rights movement back then was, it was unclear whether it was here to stay or whether it was just a little peculiar little blip on the body politic. It felt like, I think I describe it as sort of like a tender green shoot, coming through this sort of mass of societal hatred and indifference. So that affected how we responded. We couldn't help but respond through that political lens. And the last thing the emerging gay leadership, the gay national leadership in particular, wanted to do was to talk about gay male sexuality and to address that in an honest way. The bathhouses, the commercial sex establishments, the promiscuity that had become really synonymous with liberation throughout the 1970s. I don't get into it too deeply, but I really think there is a connection between, to an extent you can see the epidemic as a consequence, a public health consequence of marginalizing, criminalizing, and stigmatizing, and giving less chances to and serving more poorly a segment of society. You can't do that to any part of society without ultimately having some kind of public health consequence.
Hi. You mentioned Harvey Milk when you were talking just now. You wrote that his death was very upsetting to you, but when you tried to talk about it with other people, they were very indifferent about it. Can you explain
Sure.
why they were like that and how that made you feel?
Well, I was in Washington at that time and was had come out to my parents a few months before. So I was like, I was going gay. I was feeling a separation from a lot of the social circle I had made when I moved to Washington. Other gay guys, but who were really resistant to being around somebody who was openly gay, let alone politically gay. That was like, the death knell, So I was already feeling that kind of alienation. And then when Mayor Moscone and Supervisor Milk were killed, the initial press coverage was really about the mayor of San Francisco, a major city, getting killed. And Harvey Milk's murder was, I don't want to say incidental, but it was really secondary. It was a peculiar, like only in California kind of thing. They got a gay guy who got elected and he got killed. So I was already, recognizing that there was something whack with that. And then with my circle in Washington of, politically ambitious, all politically precocious sorts, it was so unimportant to them. And it was, Harvey Milk was like a municipal official at the other end of the country that had nothing to do with Washington politics. It was just like kind of out there. And so that was, I think, probably, the sense of outrage and anger that I felt that I wasn't seeing reflected in the circles, that I was around in New York. There certainly were activists in Washington, but I didn't really know them at that time. So that's why I described that in there, and that was, I think, a big part of what ultimately made me decide to move to New York a few months later.
Sean, thanks for, first of all, I've read the book. I'm not going to blurt out any spoilers, but it's incredibly honest. I just felt it's kind of coming off the pages, and so I really thank you for the honesty, because that really resonates with me it resonated with me as a reader, and I think with anybody who reads the book. My question is, you were very judicious in the book in pointing fingers, and I think in a way that made it more appropriate when you did point fingers at people that you thought were culpable during the AIDS crisis. Beyond that, there's this specter which sort of lurks and you don't really address, of the relative indifference in the quote-unquote straight community. And there's an old saying about denial ain't just a river in Egypt, and we have plenty of examples in the sort of hypocritical end of the spectrum of homophobic politicians ending up finding out that they're gay. Bob Bauman, Roy Cohen, the list goes on and on. But going all the way to the other end of the spectrum of people who perhaps aren't homophobic, but somehow that they have to maybe sort of mask this air of indifference because, gee, AIDS is a disease that gay people have to worry about or have to get really invested in. So that's a gay thing, and I have to project this aura of invincible heterosexuality to the world. So I wonder if you could sort of comment on that.
I think that in the early years of the epidemic, I was already so surrounded by a gay community and sort of had a political, kind of thing that there was a part of me that had, I don't want to say not cared, but wasn't, and I don't want to say not bothered. What do I want to say? That wasn't as affected by the broader societal indifference. I was accustomed to it. I sort of already, kind of made the decision to accept that by coming out and so on. I was much more disturbed by the hypocrisy I was seeing within, my own extended, community, however that's defined. I mean, I think I understand it, and it was a very scary thing for people to be gay. I mean, in Washington in 1981, I mean, it was, less than 20 years ago that people were still being, kicked out of the State Department and everything else. There were these real witch hunt purges. That's recent history. So that's kind of what I explore a little bit in that. I don't know if that's answering your question, but most of those first years, to most of the public, being gay was synonymous with having this disease. It didn't really make any difference. I always talk about, I now take great pride. The first openly HIV positive person to run for Congress. Well, you know what? It wasn't an issue in my campaign. I was gay. That was 99% of it. The HIV thing, of course. That there was no. I'm serious. I really am. The HIV thing, in and of itself, never came up as an issue in the campaign. Except the Advocate referenced it one time. And when they referenced it, it actually then sparked a bunch of press in the district, but it was just about me being gay. I think another thing that I do want to point out that I look back at, for most of my sort of milieu at the time, right? Bright, up-and-coming, young white boys, educated, upper middle class, who may or may not have experienced whatever kind of discrimination. It was mostly more of an outrage rather than an actual experience of losing jobs or so on. That happened, but it wasn't that kind of. AIDS was a singular burden. It was the first time the system hadn't really served them. And they responded to it in a singular fashion. And in fact, when combination therapy came out and they were not as frightened, they went on with their lives. They went on to other things. But for other communities, AIDS was just like, get in line. It was just, it was just one in a hierarchy of burdens. And in fact was addressed in many of those communities. Is that Lester? No, I'm sorry. Oh, it's Lou. Oh, it's Lou. I'm sorry. Hi. I'm sorry. That it was one in a hierarchy of I'm seeing lots of people I haven't seen in a long time. One in a hierarchy of burdens, and was addressed from the beginning in an intersectional way. It wasn't let's go out and create AIDS organizations and AIDS this and AIDS that. That I think has been lost and not very well understood. A lot of people involved in the epidemic, and even people who pride themselves on knowing a lot about the history of the epidemic, when you ask them who are the earliest AIDS activists and the first people who are out about their HIV status, and they'll name Michael Callan and Richard Berkowitz and Bobby Campbell from San Francisco, Dan Turner, Phil Lansrada. There's sort of a group of them who were incredibly courageous and phenomenally important, and they're all white men. And if you ask, well, who was the first woman who was openly positive and went public? And even I posed this question to a number of women activists, and it's like, oh, that's interesting. And some, if they're from New York, they might mention Iris Dela Cruz in the late 80s. If they're from California, they might mention Mary Lucy. But they really don't know, because almost no one knows, because that history was lost. It didn't have a culture and a community around it to carry forth that. And this really came home to me. It's not that I've always had that consciousness, but a couple of years ago, I got an email from a young man in Louisville, Kentucky. And he said, I read something I'd written. He said, I wonder if you might have known my mother, Amy Sloan. And I thought, oh my God, I did know Amy Sloan. She died when he was 2 years old. She found out she had HIV right after he was born in 1985. She went on Oprah in early 1985. I don't know that she was the very first woman to go public about having HIV, but she certainly was, I think, the first on that big of a stage. And she met Michael Callan actually at a conference, and she got involved with the People with AIDS Coalition in New York. She lived in Indiana, and this young man in Louisville, who was barely more than an infant when she died, one of his grandparents had kept a box of her activism and some videotapes, and he started going through it and had become fascinated and trying to find out more about him. One of the very first staff people at the National Association of People with AIDS was a guy named Fred Garnett. I don't know if anybody knew Fred Garnett. We went to the same Jesuit boarding school, and Fred was the first person I met at the school. He gave me the tour of the campus and then got me a job in the admissions office. I get choked up talking about him. It's really important that we look at this history and we try and uncover that. And I think it's important to addressing the epidemic today. There are, Michael Callan in the last year of his life, his message to everybody who would listen was, we have to go back and look at those early years. Even I think it was even in his will. Richard Berkowitz says he got a call from the lawyer and said, Michael left a bequest to you. And Richard said, Michael didn't have anything to leave to anybody. And it was actually a letter that read to him about how he needed to go back and write about the early years. People think AIDS advocacy started with ACT UP. Well, the book and the band played on in the movie? Well, that was written before ACT UP started. There is an incredibly rich history before ACT UP that in many ways I think was much more radical than ACT UP. It was really a self-empowerment movement where we would do it ourselves. We would create our own organizations to provide services. We would create our own organizations to conduct research. We were each other's support. And it was really focused, there wasn't a lot in the way of treatments, but it was focused around the human rights issues, the stigma, the confidentiality issues, patient autonomy, privacy. And then when ACT UP came on the scene, it certainly was a self-empowerment, but it was much more focused on manipulating the levers of power in the government, putting pressure externally on these institutions of power that had served us poorly forever. And it was a real challenge to get them to start to serve us properly now. And then as treatments started to trickle out, the activist movement became overwhelmingly focused on expediting that process at the expense of these other aspects of the advocacy. And in fact, we did expedite the process quite dramatically. But again, even in that, you can look back now and say, well, you know what? For all the demonstrations we had at drug companies and the grief we thought we were giving to drug companies at the time, we didn't ever give them an ounce of grief compared to the big benefit we gave them by doing their deregulatory dirty work. It was the Reagan era. They were trying to deregulate. They could have hired all the best lobbyists in Washington and not have had it happen as fast or as profitably for them as we did through ACT UP. So, that was a challenge. You're dying, there are no choices, no options. You should have rights to something that's in process if you want to take that risk. But how do you do that while keeping all the protections to do the pre-approval testing and so on? We've had many more experiences of side effects discovered in the marketplace in the last 15 or 20 years. And that is, we have to take some responsibility for that as a result of our AIDS advocacy. Yeah.
Thank you. I walked in late, which I'm loath to do, but was immediately drawn into your reading, and it was beautiful. And I'm losing my memory, so I don't remember the organization in Washington that was happening when you guys were in ACT UP. We had a different name, and I'm just driving me crazy. But that's sort of the next thing I'm accepting is I can't remember. But
join the club.
Does anyone know here? Washington, D.C., ACT UP. We didn't have ACT UP here. We had another. It's crazy. I can't remember.
Was that Carl Goodman? And it became ACT UP.
No.
It became ACT UP, but it did. There was another name for maybe it was a matter of a few months or whatever.
A lot of folks ended up working at Memoir. We were arrested at the White House. We locked ourselves to City Hall. We were at NIH, where everybody was at NIH, and but I can't remember. But it was wonderful then. What I wanted to ask you, and you just talked a lot about it. Tell me what you think of an alternate reality, and there's a disease in Southeast Asia or somewhere, and people are dying. And I heard you say, well, the ennobling, hero of AIDS. But if it happened there, would anything have happened? Would the number of people have done the research that was done? Talk to me about what would happen if it hadn't been gay men screaming, privilege, whatever, right. Forgive us that. What would
But the answer is obvious, right?
But, I don't see that. And maybe I'm not reading enough these days. I don't see that being acknowledged.
Well, because it's still the reality in most of the world. What we spend on healthcare here is, how do you in a big picture way justify that kind of allocation of resources here?
But I'm talking about, so now there are the medications to then be utilized all over the world. I'm saying, what if it was just people somewhere else dying and not in the United States?
Well, you just had the other day the CEO of, was it Bayer? Anybody know the quote? He said, we developed our drugs for Western people who could afford them, not people in Africa who couldn't afford them. That's pretty close to it. Literally, the CEO of a global drug company. It was just in the last week or two. And the fact is, in all sorts of places in the world, there are many people dying of things that are quite easily preventable. I never got more grief for anything I ever wrote in Pause than a column I wrote when PEPFAR was under consideration. Seen as the great triumph, the wonderful humanitarian, success of the Bush administration. And there's no question PEPFAR has gotten treatment for many people and saved millions of lives. But PEPFAR didn't happen because of AIDS activists. We had nothing to do with it. PEPFAR happened because you had the Christian evangelicals in favor of it because it would fund their missionary work. They could go in to do health. You had drug companies in favor of it because they were terrified of losing their intellectual property protections as these countries would declare national emergencies and would go and make generics. They would rather give the drug away and protect the intellectual property stuff, because that's a much bigger thing, than risk cracking the armor of their property rights around the drugs. And in many cases, AIDS work was what was creating a marketing system network for them in countries with emerging economies and emerging healthcare systems. I remember Xavier and I were in Zimbabwe with Phil Wilson in like 1997 or 98. And I met with the director of the Matabele AIDS Clinic outside of Bulawayo. And then I met with a group of people with AIDS. I'll never forget, I said I wanted to meet with a group of people with AIDS. And he looked kind of confused. And I said, well, I just like to talk directly to, you know, And he got a group together, and then he was sitting there in the room, and I said, no, I want to be just people with AIDS. he was like, so, and it was very awkward at first. And then we started talking about diarrhea, and boy, we were there. But the director of that clinic told me, this was not long after combination therapy had come out, and he named a drug company that came and had provided them a certain amount of treatment. And they distributed it however they decided to distribute it. And a small number of people in an area with, you know, I think hundreds of thousands of people with HIV got better, visibly better. Then that was all the meds they had. But anybody else who could beg, borrow, or steal any resources to get the drugs then did so. It was like this giant vacuuming of resources out of these countries. So the column I wrote, I'm going roundabout way, was that if we were really concerned about AIDS in Africa and the health care of Africans, we would provide the money to buy pain medication and anti-infectious agents and anti-diarrheal agents and malaria nets and clean water that I think in the long run ultimately would have done much more to improve the health. But, you know, AIDS was dealt with in a singular way. This sort of disease-specific approach to healthcare service delivery around the world is breaking down, because it ultimately, you know, what is the point? You know, if people are dying of all these other things, if their viral load is down.
We have time for one more question if there is one. Thank you.
Hi, Sean. I just wanted to ask you a little bit about what you're doing now with
Thank
Sero.
you.
And I'm sure there are a lot of differences, but talking about the differences of the activism then and what you're facing now and also the parallels.
Sure. So the book kind of traces, I mean, it does, examine the arc of my own activism. And in the last chapter, I talk about the work that I've been focused on in the last few years, which is a phenomenon we call HIV criminalization, which is the inappropriate use of someone's HIV status in the context of a criminal prosecution. And it's a complex issue. It's counterintuitive. If I ask you to close your eyes and to think in your head your honest, true answer to this question, and I say, do you think it should be a criminal offense for someone with HIV not to disclose that before they have sex? Most people say, yeah, that should be a crime. And in fact, there's survey research showing that about 2/3 of gay men think that should be a crime. But these statutes and these prosecutions have little to do with whether or not there's any risk. Rarely is there ever any HIV transmission, certainly way less than 10% of the cases, maybe less than 5% of the cases. And they are about stigma. They are about holding out one sexually transmitted disease and treating it in a dramatically different way than we treat other sexually transmitted diseases. More women in the U.S. died last year of cervical cancer from HPV, human papillomavirus, than died of AIDS. But we don't have 34 states that have HPV-specific statutes that only apply to people with HPV. We are, every once in a while I hear somebody talk about some movement, and they say the last great civil rights struggle was, transgender rights or this or that or whatever. And they are blind to the fact that we are constantly finding new ways to oppress people. And in this case, we are creating a viral underclass in the law with different criminal laws for people who have HIV than for everybody else. And most people, when they really think about it, they understand it's not a good idea to create different laws for different parts of society based on immutable characteristics, whether it's your skin color, or your gender, your sexual orientation, your physical ability or disability, or your genetic makeup. But we're doing that with this virus. Now, it's imposed a horrific injustice on people with HIV. We've documented at the Sero Project more than 1,000 instances when charges have been filed under HIV-specific statutes. which doesn't even include cases where, someone is charged with a felony or attempted murder because they spit at somebody, under a regular assault statute that gets hyped up way beyond. There are people sitting, there's a member of our board of directors of the Sero Project who is in Idaho right now. He was convicted of not disclosing to his girlfriend, even though he describes, and he had been in the paper about being positive. His coworkers all said this woman knew, she worked with them as well. While I was out there, I met someone who said he had discussed his HIV status with his girlfriend, but she had gone back to an old boyfriend or whatever. So everybody agrees he used a condom. He had an undetectable viral load. Of course, he did not transmit the virus. And he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. And he's 3 years into a 30-year sentence right now. Another person, Nick Rhodes in Iowa, met a guy online, went over to his house. They used a condom. Nick had an undetectable viral load. Of course, he did not transmit. And he got 25 years in prison. He was fortunately let out after a year. The judge reconsidered the sentence in response to outcry from activists. But he still has lifetime sex offender registration requirements. He wears an ankle bracelet. He can't travel without permission of the court. He can't be around children under 18 unsupervised. He can't use any social networking. He has to agree to allow his computer to be searched at any time. He has to take lie detector tests administered by the state of Iowa. He can only have sexual contacts within the context of a healthy relationship, as the state defines that. These lie detector tests include also, are you attracted to wearing women's clothing? Are you attracted to having sex with children? Are you attracted to having sex with animals? Which he points out is not illegal in Iowa. But, Robert Suttle, who's my associate with the Sero Project, called me less than 48 hours after he had gotten out of a Louisiana prison where he had served 6 months for not disclosing to a partner, an older partner, by the way, who was a pharmacist. And of course did not transmit. The relationship was contentious. The partner was threatening to turn him in to the police for not having initially disclosed when they met if Robert broke up with him, and that's exactly what the partner did when Robert did break up. And Robert got home, and he didn't know there was this name for this phenomenon that's fairly new, but he got online and was researching, and he said, I was trying to understand what happened to me, and he found something I had written and my phone number, and he called me. And when he called me, my partner and I were on a long road trip, and we were 30 miles away in Louisiana. And he started describing this, and I'm like, I've been looking for you. And Robert became the first person this has happened to who's gone public. And we made a short film with Robert and Nick, the guy from Iowa, and a woman from Monique Moret from South Carolina. And this is a growing phenomenon. Stigma, HIV-related stigma, is much worse today than it's ever been before. HIV-negative people often think, really? Because if you don't have HIV, you generally think of stigma in terms of your own fear of casual contagion. And you're not as afraid of it as you once were, right? There was a time we didn't know as much, everybody was afraid. And, most people are paying attention, understand it's not so easy to get. So that's fear of casual contagion, and that has declined, although it's still substantial in the U.S. About 20% of the people in the U.S. think you can get HIV from a drinking glass. I think it's 12% from a toilet seat. But which is higher than any other Western industrialized democracy, but it has declined over the years. But stigma is, as experienced by people with HIV, is about marginalization and prejudgment and othering. It's about having your words discounted before they even come out of your mouth. And in that regard, most people I know with HIV really believe that it is worse. It also is in many ways more dangerous to disclose one's HIV status today than it was years ago. Years ago in the gay community, most people didn't know if they were positive or not. There wasn't that kind of judgment when somebody comes out about being positive. And when somebody did come out about being positive years ago, they were enveloped by a loving gay community that accepted this as a communal responsibility. We will get through this together. And there was this incredible expression of love from the whole broader queer community to people who are positive. And that is gone. The LGBT community has really abdicated on this issue. There is some sign that might be coming back a little bit. It's almost impossible for it not to because of the rising rates of seroconversion with young African American men, but and young gay men in general. And the disclosure issue, I personally believe that when there is not a measurable risk of transmission, disclosure is morally neutral. I don't think there's any a moral obligation to disclose when there's not a risk there. No one should knowingly put another person at risk of harm, but you have to separate morality from what is appropriate to make legal. In addition to the injustice these prosecutions put on people with HIV and the extent to which they drive stigma, they're horrific public health policy because you can't be prosecuted if you don't know you're positive. So it's become take the test and risk arrest. It discourages people from getting tested. It penalizes the responsible behavior of getting tested and privileges the ignorance of not getting tested. And there's also now research showing, actually we did a big survey of 2,000 people with HIV in the US in conjunction with Eastern Michigan University, and more than 25% of them said they knew one or more people who were afraid to get tested for fear of being criminalized. A big study came out of Canada a few months ago showing that in places where there are these criminalization statutes, people with HIV are far less trustful of public health and less cooperative in traditional public health disease control measures, whether partner notification or treatment adherence programs or whatever. So, you know, it's my belief that this is not just an enormous driver of stigma, you know, impairing the quality and justice for people with HIV, the quality of life and justice for people with HIV. It also is a huge driver of the epidemic and public health threat. So that's been my work in the last several years. You're all welcome to join seroproject.com.
Well, thank you so much.
Okay,
Sean,
thank you.
for your